Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and joining me today is Emily Katebini, here to talk to us about her work with Katebini Creative, her company. Without any further ado, Emily, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Noah. I really appreciate it.
So let's kick things off. What is Katebini Creative? Who's involved? How did it get started? What does it do?
Katebini Creative is my company, but it feels egregious to say that because there's really about 5 New York City teachers working on it with me. But I'm the one who, took the plunge more financially and with time commitments. And we noticed that with STEAM movements and reading movements, it seems like all these areas are getting really advanced, that were sort of being left behind in education. And now writing has sort of been left behind. And when you're thinking about cultural responsiveness and new research, it seems like a lot is being poured into other subjects. And writing has sort of stayed the same in a lot of ways, especially at the elementary level. And we saw an area that it as an area that could be improved. A bunch of us had taken like a few seminars here and there. And we started getting excited about some of what we were reading because the research is there. It's just not really being bridged to schools as much. That's how it started. Specifically, we started realizing that how narrative storytelling is taught doesn't really speak to the way stories are being told in homes. Not really any culture tells stories in homes the way narrative writing is taught at the elementary level. But that gap gets wider and wider depending on sort of socioeconomic and cultural background. And they say it takes 50 years for research to hit the classroom, but some of this research is really, really old. Some of the noticing how there are these rich stories being told at home, and then these students are not being considered creative writers in school. And what's that gap happening? Well, obviously, it's something in the access of our education or how we're teaching versus it is that child isn't in an enriched, storied environment. So we started creating materials to build that gap and to make students enjoy writing more, which we saw all these kids hating writing. And we realized that was part of a bad feedback model that is very popular in schools. We're really excited with what we produced. We put a lot of thought and care into it. And the schools who have taken on our supplemental materials, or even just our ideas and PDs have responded well to it. So we're pretty excited.
So Katebini Creative is really focused on writing, which is, one of these subjects that is taught in a sort of archaic way as developments in other fields have made their way into the classroom. So a lot of STEM focused or STEAM focused schools have like space age, cutting edge programming, whereas writing is the neglected subject in the corner that kids are hating because and you say the feedback model is off. So could you tell me more about that?
Sure. So currently in schools, majority of schools have a one-on-one feedback model where the student is incredibly passive. So they're creating a story, which should be just the most innate thing. If all of us grew up with stories, even your family's just telling stories of your first word or this hilarious time you did this as a baby at an inappropriate moment. Everyone has story. And then we come to the classroom, they write a story down on paper, usually a personal narrative. That's the beginning unit for a lot of elementary schools. And they go to their one-on-one feedback session and the teacher analyzes it critically, which is his or her job. And then these students passively get criticized on the art they produced, which is tough. It's tough for anyone, but it's really tough for a 6-year-old. And then they shut down, and then what they're interpreting or internalizing is that their writing isn't good or their story isn't worthy. And I think that a lot of kids hate writing and think they're quote unquote bad at it, when really what our research has shown is that and we're seeing in schools, that if you change that feedback model so that you have the conversation about what needs improving in that student's writing on a mentor text, as opposed to the student's work themselves, the student can become engaged in the conversation. You can prime the student to be thinking about a specific area they might need improving in. And then when you look at their work, they can identify those areas themselves. I know that might sound a little confusing. I'm not sure if I worded it as succinctly as usual, but it's just a little bit of a switch in the model where the student becomes active. We detach the student from the criticism a little bit, and then we're not criticizing their style of story. We're just identifying area of needs they could focus on. And we've had success where students are enjoying writing more. And we're opening up different, larger ranges of stories that are accepted in classrooms.
Mentor text. You're teaching students not on their own work, but through someone else's work?
Correct. So this is an idea that we stole from social workers. And social workers use it in emergency situations where they, if a student has been or a child has been through something traumatic, they will ask a child, what happened to you on this doll, usually, or some sort of figure. And the reason for that is students feel very sensitive, guarded, and break down when it's something that happened to themselves. But they can be incredibly engaged and active and part of the conversation if they're explaining the same thing on a different figure. So we took that concept, and although we're not putting students in emergency situations at all, they are bringing us their art, their story, their writing. It is very sensitive, and if you talk about it directly, they can put up those same walls. So we've, and honestly, we stole a lot from Carl Anderson's areas, high areas of need, but also we checked, regular teachers' assessments and other areas of research to come up with sort of our list of the 13 common areas of need in writing. And we made 13 books for those areas of need. So things like not a lot of voice, or lack of transition words, or, poor word choice, or whatever it may be. And we made a mentor text for each of those areas. Now, our mentor texts have two versions of the same book. One where the area is not addressed, and one where the area is addressed. So, for example, in our transition word books, the first story has no transition words. The second story is exactly the same, but with transition words. So if a student comes to me with their text and the student has no transition words in their story, I put the student product aside. I bring out our transition word text. I look at the two versions of the story really quickly, and the student identifies which version is better. We have a facilitated conversation about it, why transition words move the piece more. Then we put the mentor text aside and bring the student's work back out. And honestly, not all the time it goes perfectly, but pretty regularly, the student will say, oh my goodness, I should add transition. They're the first to mention it. They're active. And you've basically changed from a dictator of the conversation to a facilitator of the conversation. And you've opened their brain up, because instead of adding like 4 transition words, which I found was the way when I used the old model, where like, what can we put in? The student is excited about adding transition words, is thinking about it in their own autonomous way. So, it's just good practice. And obviously we're a company and we're trying to take off, and we have our books and we put a lot of thought and care into them. But like, side note, teachers, you don't have to buy our books. You could write your own versions. You can use mentor texts off your shelf even, and put your own kit together. It's really, I know that as a business person, that's probably a bad idea to say there's a low barrier to entry. But as a teacher, I want you to tell you could probably improve your feedback model to have your students enjoy writing more.
I think this idea of taking the toolkit of a social worker or anybody who's working in a trauma informed way and bringing those ideas into the classroom is not by any means a far fetched approach. In fact, it's what everybody should be doing, because the classroom can be a site of trauma for kids, especially when we're talking about creative work and things that kids take some ownership over, but they're also meant to learn how to improve. And depending on how you do that, critical feedback, it can be really tough. Like I remember back in my own childhood, getting papers back that I had written and like really feeling it when it wasn't up to snuff. So the learning how not to write in passive voice was something that was that was a high school thing, so it was a little different. I was a little bit more emotionally developed than an elementary aged child, but it was still just a very difficult, like, because I wasn't getting it. So taking that trauma informed approach is a really useful practice, I think.
The amount of parents who say to me, like, my kid hated writing, my kid loves writing now, or you have a gift, you're magical, what did you do? And I who doesn't love being called magical? It's like it's not really as magic as it is well informed, like what you said, right? It's thinking of these people as people, not just academic growth, but human beings who are bringing their cultural experiences and artwork into your classroom. Yes, we have to move them. Yes, we have to put that growth there. Our job is to be teachers, but we're not doing a very good job if we make every kid hate the subject or, give them a little bit of trauma with their learning.
Right. And if you take the passive quality out of the student's experience, if you're really teaching them to take some agency and become more autonomous as writers or as any creators, they also then, especially if you're coaching them through self-feedback, being able to look at work and provide feedback is what students need in order to start giving each other feedback as well. And so, if you're trying to have this one-on-one experience between teacher and student, and that's the be-all end-all, then yeah, that's fine. That can still be useful for a student to be able to do self-feedback. But then, if you're really trying to build an academic community, then that one-to-one relationship can then, once you've coached the feedback process, can then be from student to student. Is that
applied? For sure. And something you said just ignited this in me is that, I keep bringing up the transition book, but it just happens to be the one in this story as well. A student was coming to me. He forgot his transition words. There just weren't very many in the text. And I pulled out the transition book to have the conversation. Before, he's like, seen that before. I know. He's like, I forgot. He was ready to go do it himself, even just looking at the visual of the book, which probably meant I've been like using my books too much or whatnot. But instead of those sort of like F&P kits or running record kits that are swirled away and, you only use them for assessment and they're scary, I feel like our books are ubiquitous and talked about, and it really opens their minds up to these high area of needs in elementary schools. But even more than that, our teachers are noticing more in the writing themselves. Before, I think teachers like most commonly notice leads as being weak. Why? Because you have, look, the one-on-one writing period is so stressful. You have 30 kids in the class. You're supposed to be giving like meaningful feedback to one student and be present. And you're probably like running a small group at the same time. Like the nightmare of the scheduling and programming as a teacher is tough. So I lost my train of thought a little bit because I just got so stressed out. But so you're like, quickly, what do I notice on the page? Well, usually it's like a conventions or leads, but are those the most meaningful part of feedback? Probably not. But when you have a kit of 13 books next to you, it's almost like a cheat sheet of 13 books. You're like, I should be thinking more about voice or sequence, or have I checked for stretching the setting? So it not only opens up the students' minds to what are high areas of needs in elementary texts, it opens up the teachers' minds to what are high areas of need in elementary texts, which is an easy tool to add to your classroom.
Right. And speaking of classrooms, a big part of the show is bringing teacher voices back into conversations about teaching. So everybody, at some point in the show, shares their teacher story. Like, how did you get here, or how did you get there? And then if you're depending on where you are now, how did you get from there to
To
to where you are presently?
Yeah, so I went to University of Colorado for undergrad. I was an anth major for anthropology, and I just really loved people, culture. I was one of those third culture kids. So my family moved around a lot, and one of my least favorite questions is where are you from? Because it's like too difficult to answer. But one thing I did gain out of my experiences is just like a really large respect for people and interest in people. And what's funny, I think when I was younger and an anth major, I thought people were so different. And the more I work with children and family of different backgrounds, the more I'm like, all parents just want a great education for their children. Now I see people as all the same. So I really wanted to work with people. I was an anthropology major. I didn't want to become an academia anthropologist. And I moved with my now husband, then boyfriend, to St. Louis for him to go to grad school. And I was feeling lost. The only job opening that really paid well and fit well was an after-school teacher for the Center for Survivors of Torture and War Trauma, which is a big title, but it's basically just a refugee center. It's an intense title, but more, I just worked with a refugee population of after-school kids. And I realized that working with children is working with people. And I got a big taste for sort of the type of child I would prefer to work with, which is, in teachers' terms, I would say, I'm less interested in the typical student. So my husband is an architect, so he was coming to New York next to start at his first firm. And I applied to the Teachers College program for intellectual disabilities and autism. And even though I have a special training and background, which is where I started, I went to a DOE gen ed classroom. And then I taught gen ed for a while, and now I'm back to special ed again. So I feel very lucky to, it was so interesting when you were saying trauma-based strategies in a classroom work well. In my opinion, what's good for special ed kids is good for all kids. Oh, you need multimodal ways of learning. Oh, guess what? So does every kid. Like, oh, you need frequent breaks. Guess what? So does every kid. So I really appreciate sort of a background for the unique, because I have found that it's true for all children. Yeah.
Right. And that's sort of the interesting thing about the concept of a typical child, is that there's no actual typical, there's no actual average child. Everybody's got their own unique needs, and so teaching to the typical usually just neglects everybody in
Doesn't
one way
exist.
or many ways. Yeah. Sort of a, yeah.
Yeah, there's no typical brain. There's not one person in this world has a typical brain. Exactly. Your brain is going to look one way more or another to a diagnosis. It's just, does it go so far that it receives the diagnosis?
We've reached the point where you are in a gen ed classroom in the DOE.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still in the DOE?
No, I'm no longer in the DOE because I needed to put some time into creating Katebini Creative, which I guess is very repetitive. But so I went to, believe it or not, set teaching, which was like very good for me because you're all day on a set. So there's a lot of dead time where I was putting together my company stuff. And then the kids come off of acting and you teach them. So that lent me to build the company, but I have moved since then to adjacent company to set teaching, which is the School for Young Performers, which because I have more time and can give more to the classroom now. I'm in a school that it's very interesting because it's very different from the DOE schools with like very high needs families. It's quite the opposite. The families I work with now tend to be, really privileged in a lot of ways. And it's so crazy how similar the parents are in that everyone just wants the best for their child, no matter what. I think just parents worry about and want the best for their children. So I'm actually really grateful to have sort of this stark dichotomy or like contrast or juxtaposition of these different environments where you're like, oh, but it's all kind of the same. And I still stress as a teacher and I still stay up at night worried. Yeah.
Right, it's a pretty broad range of places, but no matter what, like every kid needs a good education. Everybody and every parent wants a good education for their kids. I'm thinking about so we did a couple of episodes a few weeks ago on gifted and talented education, and one of the big takeaways is that gifted and talented education is not necessarily for the gifted and talented. The main indicator is, the amount of time that parents have to advocate for their children, and to, provide the preparation for the test that they need in order to get through. Back when there was a test, that is, but now it's really just parent advocacy. And I'm also thinking about child actors and like young performers, like the amount of advocacy that goes into getting a role as a young child in any sort of performance it's similar.
My first placement in the DOE was a gifted and talented classroom.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. So, which was interesting. It was very interesting. It was Brooklyn school. We were a free and reduced lunch school, but we were borderline. It was a gentrifying area. I left before gentrification really took off, but like everyone was like watching it drip in. So my student population actually match the rest of the school. I know that usually there tends to be sort of like a classroom which is very visually different because you walk by and there's suddenly like and I hope this isn't too blunt, but like Asian and white kids in the school are in one classroom and they say, oh, that's the gifted and talented. That was like not so much the case. My gifted and talented students were, the school was not diverse. It was mostly Black students. And my classroom matched that as well. Yeah. But my parents in my classroom definitely still had advantages and more time for advocacy. And, I think it's really important not to link race with privilege. There is still, those things are separate. I know they can sometimes be conflated, but I would say those kids in my class still had a lot of advocacy and privileges that were getting them into that classroom.
It's an intersectional question, the question of privilege in schools, because you're right, like the race and socioeconomic status are often conflated, and statistically there is a very large overlap in New York City Department of Education schools. However, they are not the same thing. There
Correct.
Is some there are certainly enough cases in which there is not a one-to-one overlap that it's worth considering that socioeconomic status and race are not the same. Socioeconomic status and
time privilege
is really a thing on its own. Yeah. And
yeah.
So certainly worth keeping in mind. So you were in a DOE school, you got into set teaching, which I was trying to figure out what that acronym is, but it's not. It's
it's like a movie set. Yeah.
I was like, sets?
No, not like a set classroom.
Right.
Yeah.
So
no.
So then you're back in a school, but it's a school that's particularly for students who are who are also performing.
Yes. Yeah. And I truly recommend, if you are wanting to do like a deep research dive, or you want to start something, I found the set environment really got to practice my teaching muscles still, but got a lot of time to do some of my own things. So, contact me if you're looking for advice on how to get into that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So now I'm at the school, yeah, and I'm still doing Katebini Creative stuff. So I feel like we're in a good spot.
Yeah. So tell me a little more about your research that you were able to get into while you were while you were teaching on set, and that you've continued conducting, I presume, so that that this is the research that sort of justifies the company. How does it do that?
Sure. So we basically have 3 areas of research we dived in on: story planning, vocabulary use, and the feedback. The feedback is sort of ours, and by that I mean we use like psychological research and neurological research, and we put together an educational program with it. The planning and the vocabulary is very borrowed. There's a lot of other programs that look similar. I feel like whether our company survives and thrives or not, it's going to get out there. So one area is planning, and that is this idea that we are doing these beginning, middle, end worksheets with problem and solution. Are terrible ways to teach children to plan stories. Hardly anyone's family stories look like that. And the few families who do look like, whose stories look like that, are limited. And then those students are getting a huge advantage. But even those students, it's an advantage, but it's still not that accessible. When you talk about beginning, middle, end as like 3/3 of a pie, that's not how stories work. So really poor access for every student to teach that way. And then really, really poor access for students whose home families stories don't sound like that at all. So there's lots of research out there about how to reword planning. For the younger students, one that's not ours that I really like is the Brady doll. It's literally a doll. It's way too expensive in my opinion. So I make my own if I'm mimicking the Brady doll, but it's tactile, and you touch the head for the beginning, and you talk about the characters, and you touch the doll's heart, and you talk about the character's feelings, and it's a different way. Our programming sheets break down beginning and we use the language, character setting, turning point. I have seen other research call it character setting kickoff. So it's just this idea that you don't just tell kids, oh, do a beginning, middle, and end. What does that even mean? You explain what's in the beginning. You explain what's in the middle. You explain that an end is usually just one sentence long. It's okay for your story not to have a beginning, not to have a problem solution. It's okay if at home your stories are circular and your end comes back 3 times. We can talk about that. So when you give specific names to the parts of a story, students can then start being like, oh, my story at home matches that. Or if it doesn't, they can start explaining why, and you can have a conversation about it, and you're not shutting anyone out. As a side note, not our research, but other people who have changed formats of research shows that their F&P levels go up. Because when they're asked comprehension questions, like what happened in the beginning of the story, they're like, oh, I should say character setting, turning, like once you know how a story goes together, it doesn't just improve your writing, it can improve your reading. And when you have a different plan that's more concrete and more accessible, more cultures can see themselves represented in those stories. So something to keep in mind is if your school is doing a big push, which I know a lot of schools are lately, and I'm so happy for it, for more representation in children's books, it shouldn't just be authors of color, although that is important. It's stories that are also culturally different. So I have found a lot of programs are like, we've included a lot of authors of color, and it's all still problem solution stories. And so when you're thinking about representation, it's not just, although that is an important piece, where's the author from or what does the author look like? It's also, what does the story represent? Is it moralistic? Is it enigmatic? Is it episodic. Not that one of these stories is more important than the other, just we need variety. We need a range of mentor texts and a range of planning concepts and more accessibility to all our children for improved writing and storytelling.
You've taken that research and developed your 13 books, your 13 mentor texts, where there are two different versions, one with and one without each of these critical elements in writing and storytelling. And you've sort of packaged everything up so that teachers can begin implementing this new approach to, or improved approach to.
Correct. And like I said earlier, you could buy from us, or you could make your own. There's so much research online. One school we did a PD in, and that's something important to note. Some schools just book us for a PD, take our ideas, and make their own stuff, which we love to see too. But this one school that we did it in, they really made it their own. And instead of pictures for characters and setting and turning point, they decided, since they were a school with high turnover, it was important that the teachers who had been there a long time were represented. And they took pictures of teachers who had been there a long time for characters. And they did some interesting things of like the gym for setting. And they brought those pictures down to even their like pre-K levels and had them puzzling it. So they were puzzling like 1, 2, 3, ABC, character setting, turning point, which I thought was so impressive. Because we could be teaching building blocks of the story at a younger age. So yes, we want you to come buy our stuff, but you can book us for a PD or talk to us. We have some free videos. What we really want is a next generation of writers who love storytelling and have more diverse options. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so who really is your target market in all of this? Is it everybody, or is it? Do you have particular schools and particular communities in mind? Who are you trying to sell to?
So, I mean, ideally for us, it would be New York City elementary schools is our dream, and the way we've gone about that, slowly, surely learning different things. You need a famous number, which is a vendor number, which took us a while to figure out how to get. There's these beautiful, especially with COVID, things called MTACs, which is like a multiple task award contract, which is a fancy way of saying like New York City will buy your curriculum. For people in other fields, it's like an RFP or a response to a proposal. And COVID, they poured some money in. They're asking for proposals. I don't know if I've gone off topic from your question, but those big publishing houses, those big companies, even a big school like Hunter and Teachers College, they have whole staffs that they can dedicate their time to building this. We are like 5 school teachers who are really busy, who miss deadlines and keep trying to put together these packages that we miss. So I think we would be great for all elementary schools. I just don't know if we can go the same routes as some of those other bigger companies and publishing houses can just annihilate those competitions and win those contracts and be in all public schools right away, which is unfortunate for us.
FAMUS sounds familiar to me, and I don't know the MTAC or whatever that is, but I have heard of FAMUS numbers. So you're looking to be doing business with the New York City Department of Education,
correct,
which has this incredibly extensive vetting process that seems to it seems to let big companies through a little bit more easily and faster than a small company, and that's just economics of scale, right? You've got massive staff,
correct,
yeah.
Correct.
But not so much here. Okay.
And that famous number is not easy to get. Like, when you're trying to apply for a restaurant and they're like, oh, you need restaurant experience. You're like, well, how do you get restaurant? That's what the famous number is like. They're like, well, you need to be in schools. And you're like, how do you get in schools? They're like, well, you need a famous number. You're like, you end up having to. What we ended up doing was speaking to a group of principals through a superintendent, and how we did that is we paid for the breakfast for a bunch of principals,
Wow.
which was tricky financially. Again, everything is like a financial decision for us because we're not quite at the point where we're sort of making money. So every cent we spend is, in hopes to improve education.
Right.
But luckily they listened and they were really responsive. And one of those principals used their own budget, which was a low income school and a risk on her part, which I will always be thankful for, because she thought her kids' writing would improve or her teachers' teaching methods would improve.
Mm-hmm.
So she paid us. And once she paid us, we were able to then beg her to put a application with the DOE that we were in her school providing PD and getting the famous number. So that was like how we got our restaurant experience, if you will.
So was her sort of interceding on your behalf? Was that what secured for you your famous number?
Correct. But that by no means means you win the multiple task award contract, which is the MTAC, which is once you win an MTAC, schools sort of will buy your stuff. The DOE will have, it's almost like military contracting. The DOE set a contract with you. You provide a certain amount of your materials or your PDs. You're on a list. Schools will have you in. I would be able to quit my job as a classroom teacher to fully dedicate my time to Katebini Creative if I could win one of those MTAC contracts. But as you can imagine, it is institutions like universities or publishing houses that I've only seen win those. Yeah.
Because they're able to offer the service or the product at a lower cost, and so it's that economics of scale, or is there another component to it as well?
There's another component as well, which is we've never made a deadline. It's just extensive. They are rightfully so, and so the DOE should be so. Like like I actually believe in the MTech process. You have to show your research. You have to show this. You have to show that. It's just really hard to get that many materials together when you're a group of school teachers versus like an institution.
Right. And what goes into that deadline? What are they asking you for at that certain time on that certain day?
Oh, wow. I could even open one up right now. It is, well, one of the big things is the research that goes into it. They love case studies. Again, we're a little weaker on that. We don't necessarily have the hard data, which we're trying to be more. That's like our goal of this year is the schools that are using our stuff to go back in and be like, hey, can we start tracking this mathematically so that we can win some more MTechs? It is things like, it's like you said, being able to lower your costs. I wish I could show you all the appendices. It's complicated. Research, appendixes, it's all very dry. It's all, if you're Teachers College, you have these numbers. If you're Pearson, you have all the money, all the research, all the numbers, all the everything. You can plug in one of those MTechs overnight and get a bid the next day.
So each MTech is just a report. It's asking for a report on a quick
correct
turnover.
Yeah. Okay. And who is on it, your how long, why am I blanking right now, the CVs of your team, it's really intense. And some of them are open-ended, but they're less likely to be granted. So it's like, do you put the time into really trying to get this one MTech that doesn't quite fit your company's goals, but is open-ended, so you could spend forever on it, and then likely they're not really handing those out anymore? Or do you go to this one that completely fits your goal, but you're going to have to figure out how to get everyone to get this together overnight? Oh, and it got closed 2 weeks later and you couldn't get it together, which is weird. And then you're sitting there like, are our facts even strong enough? Are our case studies strong enough? Which, I'm not disparaging the DOE for wanting strong case studies and facts. That is something we should be collecting more of. But it was just a very surprising and different process. Even if we had those case studies and facts, I just don't think we could compete with the big companies, which is a little intimidating.
Right. Right. And I'm sure, the taxpayers listening are probably at least a little bit reassured that wheelbarrows full of money aren't just going to anybody who puts in a proposal. But I think the teachers in the audience are probably who, everybody who teaches is creating something. And I think a lot of teachers, we're all creating something for a localized environment. We're making something for our classroom, but we're probably taking a look at it sometimes and thinking like, man, this is good. This would be great elsewhere. This is something that I think a lot of people could use. And so I think a lot of teachers who like also moonlight as creatives or are creative people who happen to be in the classroom as well. And so they're probably thinking like, oh, but so that actually is a great deal of work. If I ever wanted to get my stuff into the hands of more people, it is a very extensive process that I would.
It is. Yeah. And we were a little ignorant. We got super excited. We poured all our initial funding into like the creation of the product. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest if you are a teacher out there, save half your budget for the DOE, figuring out how to process the DOE at least, right? It's extensive, it's time consuming, and that often leads to being expensive. Yeah.
And you mentioned the CVs of your staff. So that's another question I have is, do you have DOE teachers on your staff, and how do you avoid conflict of interest issues if that's the case?
I do have DOE teachers on my staff, and I think we just have to, I mean, it's funny to be asked that, not because that's a fair question, but it's like Pearson in my mind is like the biggest conflict issue. I'm like, well, but yeah, I'm no longer a DOE teacher. We all started out as DOE teachers. I think we're down to one left. It is super complicated. I am being a witness in a lawsuit for a family coming up, and I'm like, but I don't want to be on a lawsuit to do with anything with my name Katebini. I want to be in good standing with anyone. I don't know how to word that, and I probably shouldn't be advertising that, but there is this issue where the DOE is our client and the people we want to serve, and the place where children are going to really benefit from our models and products. And yet it's also a very complicated, bureaucratic, gigantic system that isn't always perfect. And in a lot of ways, there's reasons we're excited about ways to improve it. DOE practices or be helpful to them. And I want to see them to see us as allies or partners who have the same goal in mind, which is a better education for children. But there are conflicting issues, and I don't know if I have a good answer of if we avoid conflict of interest, because I don't think we do always, which I don't know if it's a great answer, but it's the truth. So it's complicated. But at the end of the day, I truly believe the Department of Education wants kids to learn, and that's what we want to. So hopefully that's the big picture is the most important part. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, money between friends is tricky, right? And so if the DOE is your friend, then it's difficult to keep things nice and clean. But it does seem like the important thing should be, I mean, if we were thinking about that important question of is it good for the kids, then Pearson wouldn't have any contracts except for maybe select books. It's an interesting thing as a 5-person team creating books in comparison to the people who do, or the organizations, the corporations who do have DOE contracts and the things that are made available on. I'm just thinking of every time I go through Shop DOE, looking for something in particular for my music classroom, I can't find most of the things that I need. Most of the things that I need are produced by people who don't have the contracts with the DOE.
Correct.
But I could very easily buy, if there were funding, I could get a number of grand pianos. I could get a number of all the tubas I could ever afford. But if it's down to getting a particular piece of music production equipment that I'd love for my students to have, not a chance, no way.
Yeah.
So it takes 50 years for the research to get into classrooms. It seems like it might also take about 50 years for some of the cutting edge research-based materials to get in the classroom as well.
And look, like, what is the chance that 5 loosely devoted DOE teachers keep working at this? We go through highs, we go through lows, but there is a chance at one point we just say, like, we gave it our best, we built something for the world, we got to as many people as we could. If you can't get success at a certain point, you might shut down. We're lucky that every year something new comes along. This year, the New York State Reading Association had us speaking with them and gave us an outreach award for what we're doing in literacy education. And it's just enough to keep us going. Each year there seems to be a little bit of a, hey, thanks for noticing. Yeah, we're really trying hard. Even this podcast is a boost, right? Like sitting down talking to someone about how wonderful it would be if more teacher-created content, research-based teacher-created content, people who are in the classrooms could be accessible to all of us. I mean, right. It reminds me of, that in Newark a few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg put like $100 million into improving the school system. And they spent most of it on consultants for teachers who were getting paid like $300,000 a day to consult. And they were like, you probably need to be putting more hours in, which was met by teachers as like, are you kidding me? And I was listening to a great thing on it. Like, this is very indicative of pink collar work. We make pink collar workers be over licensed, over educated, over knowledgeable, but we don't trust them with any real money, responsibility, or ideas. And there is some evidence, and look, I'm not disparaging anyone who wants to put $100 million into trying anything. We can learn lessons from what happened here, right? They gave it a go. But hey, that money probably would have been better spent if you just gave it directly to teachers. We would have given it to children. We would have, it's grassroots stuff. Really, why are we paying a consultant from a business firm when you have teachers who have to do continuing education classes and be licensed and stay fresh? What's the point of keeping us so fresh and agile if you're not going to trust us to listen to our ideas?
Right. Yeah. There's so many better ways of spending $100 million than a consultant. Any budget for consultants, that we can really dispense with that.
Except for me, if you're hiring Katebini Creative as a consultant.
I'm thinking of you more as a teacher and content creator and that sort of thing. I when I think of the consultant, any consultant who says that a teacher needs to work longer hours is not worth consulting.
Yeah. I was telling my husband the other day, he took me to a movie, in the theater, and I was so, afterwards I was like, you can never do that again. And he's like, why not? I'm like, because I grade during movies. I can't grade during a movie in the theater. That was a waste of my time.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
certainly frowned upon when you start doing it in the movie theater. They'll kick you out for that. Um, so I I'm wondering about this. So since you are not just a consultant, you're also a teacher and someone who's making stuff and all that. I'm wondering what the daily schedule looks like for you. What your process looks like when you're not grading while watching movies. What what else goes into your sort of split split working schedule?
Sure. So we do. We're trying to get our name out there and our name alive. So we do a lot of putting principals in contact with each other who learned about us, who want to show more interest. As I said, we've gotten way more involved in the New York State Reading Association, NYSRA, which if you are a teacher looking to talk to some really seasoned teachers who've been through it all, who have advice, I strongly suggest going to a NYSRA meeting. It's a great place just to hear. It's a great place just to hear ideas of what people are doing in their classrooms. I went to a NYSRA event recently where this woman just shared how she changed. I think I mentioned this. She was sick of all the writing steps being used to create a product of writing, and she changed it to her kids. Changed their product to a podcast, and they were loving it and way more engaged. And this was just she didn't have a company. She was just a teacher in a classroom going to a NYSRA event talking about cool things. So we've gotten really interested in talking about our things there, other literacy events, a few parent groups. We've done one or two more principals breakfasts, but that was a little costly for us. So we stopped that area. So really just emailing, calling, putting people in contact who've used our things, and trying to sort of, I think it's called heat mapping, but sort of warm up our presence in particular neighborhoods and areas that were already existing. So people can be like, hey, my kid's been hating writing. I've heard that your kids love writing now. What's the difference? Oh, have you heard of Katebini? And then that's what we do. Sometimes there are weeks where we're busy teaching, and honestly, it gets neglected a little bit. So I don't know what a day to day is, but it's mostly as much as we can keeping things alive, doing things like this podcast. Yeah, and listening to what teachers are doing with our books, because we design them for a particular way, but you know how creative teachers are. That's always really exciting to me. So if you are a teacher using our books out there and you use the book in an interesting way, like, oh, I communicated with a parent who didn't really know what voice was, please let me know, because I love what teachers do.
What advice would you offer to any teachers who are starting to think about generating content to use outside of their own classrooms for other folks?
Number one thing I would say is from day one, collect all your student data, before and after data, all of it, because you're going to have principals say they love your work, but if you haven't gotten the hard data, you're going to be at square one when you're trying to apply for MTACs and things like that. Number two is the famous number is not easy to get. It was about a year-long process for us. So really, before you even have, when you're thinking about budgeting, I guess my biggest piece of advice is when you're thinking about budgeting, the DOE is a bureaucratic, difficult yet necessary process. They really vet the companies they use, and it can be a costly experience. So if whatever product or idea you're making, save a good portion of your budget for dealing with the DOE process. And if you're ever interested in how to get things like a famous number, or how to look up MTACs, or go to the portal for vendors, talk to someone who's been through it before. And if you're listening right now, you can feel free to reach out to me, so I can give you like a step-by-step of some of the things we did and were successful with or unsuccessful with, because we've had our failures too.
So moving forward, you're looking to win some of these MTACs. You're looking forward to a future in which it is easier to do business with the DOE. But what are some other aspirations that you have for the company long term?
One thing that would be my dream is the third area of research that we are really interested in is how vocabulary is used in lessons and embedded in the school day. And one thing we've really noticed is that there is this thing called anchor bias, which is the first image we see with an experience or word. It can be with a lot of stuff, but since we're talking about vocabulary, let's say with a word, defines your belief of what that word means for the rest of time. It's not set in stone, but it is so strong that your brain can actually manipulate data to make subsequent information better fit that first image you had. So, for example, if you saw an image of a dog next to the word eloquent, and your teacher told you this is what eloquent is, and it was like a muddy, dirty dog, it'd be very hard for you to change your mind. Your anchor bias or your first image is what your brain is going to tell you is the truth. So we're embedding vocabulary during the school day. These really high utility tier 2 words. Teachers are in some schools doing an amazing job of, before each read aloud, priming students with a few vocabulary words. But the pictures we're using, we're not being the most careful with, in my opinion. We are just, picking a picture off the internet, and that often means not a lot of diversity with that picture. Not completely the teacher's fault. It's really hard to find diverse images, especially if you're looking for different body types, different abilities. So we are just representing the world in a very typical way, instead of representing the world as it is, which is an incredibly diverse place. So my dream in life is to have a free database for teachers where they can look up all the tier 2 words and see a kid-friendly definition, a list of antonyms, a list of synonyms, and a range of maybe 10 pictures for each image that have different diverse representations. I hope I didn't speed through that too quickly, or if that all made sense, but I think teachers want to represent the world in a diverse way. They just don't have the time to shift through 10 pages of a search engine to find it. Right. So it would be my dream to have that free and available for teachers around the world for teaching vocabulary or embedding vocabulary. Yeah, I always say, and I hope this isn't too cheesy, but if we improve anchor bias or how we represent our vocabulary in our classrooms, we're actually changing the way the next generation sees the world or perceives the world. So especially as teachers, when the kids come in, they're told, like, respect your teacher, respect what he or she says, have reverence for the classroom. And then, we're putting an image next to a word. That's a very powerful position. People talk about representation in media, but talk about representation in the place that is revered the most in a lot of ways. We are very powerful agents who need to be thoughtful with what we're doing, and we need support and tools that make it easy for us to be thoughtful.
Right. And what a tool that would be,
oh my God, yes.
Having it be available for free and easily accessible so that a teacher at 10 p.m. the night before a lesson doesn't stop on the third page of Google results when
Correct.
They would have found what they needed on page 4.
Right away. Yeah. I hope I described it clearly. I feel like I mumbled around a bit, but I know you got it. Okay. Yeah.
I think that have you started that work? Have you embarked on that with your team, or is it something that has to be on the back burner until the company becomes profitable?
Yeah, we need profit because, you asked for advice. Another thing we're realizing is how much of your content has to be copyrighted really carefully or original, licensed in a certain way. And so a database like that, even though you can get stock images for about $5, you're running into a whole problem where stock images aren't always the most diverse, because diversity isn't just about skin color. It is about, I mean, yeah, and you need like it's complicated. So where do you get the content? How do you have copyrighted material be free? And it gets complicated really quickly. Even when we're doing presentations in PDs, we are using stick figures and our own drawings and things for representation. So you have to be really careful about taking artists' content.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that would be, look, we all have a million. We all, my team, I don't know if all teachers really do have a lot of kid-friendly definitions, synonyms, antonyms with diverse pictures. We have no ownership over the pictures. We have, so the way to go about making that database is incredibly complicated. I think it would take more money than we have at the moment. And yeah, once we're profitable, next step.
Right. Yeah. So again, a scale issue that doesn't matter how great the stuff is, doesn't matter how needed the stuff is. It really does take some scale in order to.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that all the time. If someone from Facebook heard this, they could create that tomorrow, probably. Right. No problem. Right.
It would not even take $100 million.
No, it wouldn't take $100 million. And they're trying to change their image. So they would probably be like a favor for them. So I wouldn't even care if it was our company who made it. I just want that database to be out there for free for teachers. Yeah.
Right. Well, I hear Mark Zuckerberg is a listener. He's an avid fan.
Oh, wonderful.
Hopefully he's gotten the message that here's the idea, just take it and run.
Take it and run.
Yeah, and
wonderful.
Maybe put the database in the virtual reality world, the metaverse, and we'll be in great shape.
Yeah. Yeah. For some reason, I feel like there's a bigger chance we make $100 million first.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably a good bet. So, I think that's sort of we've hit an hour, so I think we're probably pretty good. Are there any closing thoughts that you want to share with our audience of listeners who I just learned today we've hit 600 listens, and that's not a whole lot, but it's
hey, that's really exciting. Yeah, that's not nothing. I would say well, I haven't thought of the code yet, which I probably should have done beforehand, but I'd love to offer your 600 listeners a discount on our materials and or a professional development if they so choose to book us. So we will make one tonight at 10% off our products, or if you contact us and said that you heard us on this podcast, we'll be happy to offer you a deal on our speaking engagements.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll be sure to mention that in the episode description as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is such a joy. Really appreciate it.
I guess we'll sign off there. Take care.
Sounds good. Bye.